Good morning. How are we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit, joined again by Chris Warren. Chris, how you doing today?
I'm doing really well.
Excellent. So let's look at a hand that was sent in, and this one was sent in by Jack. This is from Live 25. Start the hand up. So heroes under the gun, opens 220. Pretty typical under the gun open raising size in Live 25. There's a call. There's another call. There's another call. There's another call, and yet a final call. So we're going, what, 6-way to this flop, which is kind of bananas. And in this situation, small blind checks, big blind checks, and hero decides to check. So instead of talking about the check, let's look at the action first, and then we'll talk a little bit about what we would want to do in this situation ourselves. That work for you?
Yeah, that sounds great.
All right, cool. So EP2 checks, cutoff decides to fire for 100, button calls, B blinds both fold, and hero decides to check raise to 300 total. So let's just kind of read the write-up. This is some of the information that Jack sent in. So Jack said the cutoff is a tight aggressive player who tends to overplay their hand, and the cutoff sees hero as loose aggressive because sometimes they bluff a lot and they will show their hand regardless if they get caught. So good information for us to have. And in this situation, Jack has a couple main questions, and really they are, should we call the flop and shove turn? Should we raise here, and if we do raise here, is the raise too small, or should we just check shove? So kind of related in that sense. So at this point, walk us through what you're thinking in this situation. Do you like the check raise, hate the check raise? What's your thought process at this stage in the game?
Yeah, I mean, that's really what we do in this type of situation. It's a weird situation. You know, you made a reasonable play 4xing under the gun. You get into this weird pot where your hand is strong, but relative to 6 players doesn't feel that great. And you know, checking, we'll discuss later. But once we're here, it's like it feels like to me the only realistic option, without just really outside the box reads of like, you know, this is a maniac game and things like that, is yeah, we just have to call. We have vulnerable top pair, and I want to just see what happens. Like I can't imagine that like I'm ahead when I raise and get called. And so that's, you know, the basic tenets that I'm looking for in a value raise, and those don't seem to be true here. So I'm just like, yeah, I guess I call. And I feel like my hand is pretty strong, but, you know, just not enough for raising.
Totally fair. So I kind of like check raising and looking for check raises in some situations like this. But the biggest thing that really turns me off from this is the fact that the cutoff you classify as a tight aggressive player, and they fired 100 into 120, right? If they fired 40 or something smaller, okay, I could have some different thought processes. But when the tag fires 100 into a 6-way pot, I mean, sure, they might have some hands you're ahead of. You know, maybe there's some king-queen, maybe there's some king-jack, but you're probably looking at the nuttier side of their range. You're probably looking at some of the nuttier draws. Even that's debatable whether or not they fire that for 100, to be totally honest. And even though there aren't tons of combos of these monster hands, like, you're just in hell. Like I really harp on that size because you're saying this is someone who is a tag, right? They're at least trying to think about the game. I don't think this is looking good for us. And if this was a different player type, you know, we can have a very different conversation. If they're an aggressive fish or someone who just like sizes like total piss and would do this with like 10-8 just the same, okay, we have a different conversation. But the cutoff here, the tag, is not firing 100 with queen 9 of hearts or hands similar to that. I mean, they might not even do it with king 9 suited, right? That bet size again might come in closer to 40 or 50 bucks. I don't think it's coming in at 100. Are you kind of in agreement with that?
Yeah, and then, you know, we can assume he might find a few bluffs here, right? Maybe there's an occasional queen 9 type thing, or ace jack, probably more likely. And then we also have the guy behind him reacting to the tag player being like, yeah, 100 sounds good, right? So this is, you know, and we're getting great odds. So it's like, we're not folding, no question. So for me, you know, this is a call, and this is a really awkward position when we call, like not feeling super great about a lot of the turns. You know, diamond turns are super awkward. Broadway turns are super awkward. Even a 9 is pretty awkward. So we're looking at like, bricks with 8 and below.
Non-diamond bricks.
Non-diamond bricks. And,
And there's a good chunk of them, but like, what are you going to do? Are you going to lead? Because like, you don't really want that to get checked through necessarily. You don't really also want to check and face a near potter as well. Like, you're kind of in hell. And this is kind of like the benefit of doing this kind of like hand analysis off table, is that you can start spidering these decisions out. Start saying like, okay, what happens if I check call reasonably? What happens if I check raise reasonably? What happens if I would have gone back and c-bet the flop reasonably? Spidering these kind of options out off table is the benefit of doing hand analysis in the first place. So you can start saying, oh no, that option just doesn't really skew favorably, and this option, okay, that's looking okay, but let's compare it to some of the other available options too. I mean, this is just like incredibly, incredibly weird. Again, I can like check raising. I can like it if we have different profiles, at minimum for the cutoff, but because they're the one that's firing, again, 100 and a 120. But here, I just think check raising, it's not really a size issue at this point. It's just a who you're doing it against and the information that's going into that. That's unfair?
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think one of the things I don't like about this is that I think we're offering, with our original check, we're offering really good equity realization to a lot of hands that would perform well against us, just a Jack 10x, by checking and facing like the large bet. This is going to be pretty standard in this game. When you do face a bet here, you're just reducing the probability that you're going to win the hand a lot. And that's fine because we have good odds and we have a very strong hand, but it's just very uncomfortable. And this is not the type of situation I want to intentionally put myself in. And if I were doing that, I'd be really leaning on the I want to really bluff catch someone who's going to go a little bit too crazy. And given the read and given the fact that someone has already signed up for whatever this, tight tag players, large bet size range is like, it's one of the examples, like you said, of the spiderings that doesn't work out well for me in general.
Yep, exactly right. Yeah, and in the $300 check raise, talking about odds, we're talking about the odds we might get against a bet, but now we're talking about the odds we're offering, and everyone's getting a great price at this point. I mean, once EP2 folds like they do, both of these players are getting 3-1 raw. The button's getting even better if the cutoff decides to call, which they do. This is just like, we're trying to maximize value against things like flush draws and queen jack and stuff, and at the same time we're also offering them like insanely good prices, plus also saying like, hey, I have a really strong hand, and hey, there's probably the full nut of implied odds right behind me, so here's an all-you-can-eat buffet and you can make mathematically great decisions. None of that sounds particularly good to me.
And I think the one of the biggest challenges with check raising is that we have to play our entire range. And really, what types of hands are we check raising small with? That's the ideal scenario. And it's just kind of like this hand, honestly. Like with King 10, let's say, probably not playing that under the gun, but King 10 suited, let's say we're there. We're not check raising small because we're facing primarily draws. Similarly with kings and tens, and again, we're just like giving the perfect price to draws to draw out on us with good implied odds. So definitely not where we would want to be in general. And then, our bluffs are going to be strong draws in this situation. And none of those hands are going to be folding later in the hand, getting, 3-1, because we'll just have enough equity to call. So it's just like, if I'm check raising, I'm check jamming. And do I want to be check jamming here? Like in a 7 SPR pot? It's just like, not really, no. So
right. Yeah. Do we really want to check bang for 150 big blinds? Like with top pair? Sometimes, but I don't think this is the situation to do it. And you're exactly right. Like, it's really thinking about the entirety of the range, and for the hands we'd probably do it with, it is probably a check shove, but never ever check 300. Not with these stack sizes.
Yeah. So is now a good time to go into the kind of the lesson, I think?
Okay, fine. Let's go into the major lesson and then we'll run the rest of the handout. So let's go back to the flop. The blinds both check, hero checks, but let's pause it right here. So what's your thought process in this situation? So again, part of the spidering out here is we kind of just looked at what happens when we take the check approach in this situation. Obviously, we do have the cbet option on the table as well. So why don't you start that conversation off, and what do you like and dislike about cbetting here?
So again, when I look at my options in a hand, I'm always thinking about like, what are the desirable outcomes for my entire range? Or, you can split your range in two and pick two bet sizes or lines, etc. But for me, I look at a small stakes game. What are the tendencies I tend to see? Even a 2-5 game, which I know can get pretty big. But number one, people are just going to be too passive. There's not going to be that much bluffing. Especially when we're talking about a 6-way multi-way pot. People get pretty straightforward, people will try and go after it, sure, but not expecting a ton of aggression, not expecting like overbetting of, jack, 10x hands and jacks and things like that.
Just to add on one little piece to that is like the people that are going to do it are not going to be the same people that you would classify in your write-up as tags. Right? They're the players that are just kind of like a little bit bananas, a little bit crazy, maybe just overly on the lag spectrum. But you identify these people and you note this kind of stuff in a write-up. So the fact that that's not being notated here, especially the cutoff is specifically not that player, like this is not the kind of player that's going to do that kind of thing. Not at all.
We'll be very well aware of the types of players, for the most part, that are capable of making big moves in these type of pots. Because it's sort of a maniac play, and they'll be probably maniac in other situations that you'll be aware of. So, and so I'm just, again, going back to how do I play my entire range? And in a multi-way pot, one of the things I think people don't utilize nearly enough is just putting a small pot, a small sized bet. And I'm looking at it, so I'm looking at probably like $25, $30. And so you might be thinking like, oh, there's so much money in the pot. There's 6 players. That's not going to get anyone out. And it's like, yes, that's true. All those things are true. But if I'm looking at playing my entire range, what's my range here? I have hands like queens. I have hands like ace queen. Maybe I have some, I have the flush draws, queen jack suited, or just queen jack suited that has an open and a straight draw, maybe not even the flush draw. And those hands benefit an immense amount by putting out a small bet. And why is that? And it's because you're creating a very difficult situation for basically anyone who's not closing the action, which is going to be 5 or 4 people. And you're basically saying, okay, this is now the price to continue. You have to put more money in to realize the equity on your hand. So if someone has like a hand like ace 9 clubs and you put out $25 and their next act, it's going to be really not fun to continue in that situation for ace 9 club. I mean, you just can't. You have to fold. And that's because of the risk of other people behind me raising, especially small size raises have become much more plausible in this scenario. And you'll see more raises with someone with top pair and things like that, trying to be like, I want to charge a little bit more than $25, $30. Similarly, we're not limiting the range of calls. So like if someone is sitting there with queens or jacks or something like that they flat called with, they'll be like, yeah, that looks okay. That looks pretty good. I'll go for 25. I think I could still win, getting good odds. Exactly. And that's kind of a mistake in a lot of scenarios as well, because they'll be again dealing with the people behind them and potentially facing more raises, and so that's good that those people with those hands. So you're actually you're getting rid of the people who have like equity that might get free equity if in this passive game it checks around, and you're charging people who are way behind more money. So it's like that dynamic is really good. And, I'll also have to do that with strong hands here, which is probably not ideal because, again, it is a small stakes game and you'll get a ton of action. But those will protect all my small value bets and my more common frequent holdings. And so for me, this is a lesson in why it's so good to bet small in a multi-way pot in a small stakes game.
That's a really good explanation. And I like the smaller as a default. My personal bet size would probably be just a hair larger than you suggested. Probably be like in the 30 to 35 ballpark rather than 25 to 30. But I mean, either way, we're still in the same ballpark. We're still well under half pot. And I like the reasoning and rationale. I like what Hero is doing here. I like that Jack is trying to be creative. That Jack is trying to think about other lines, and I have no problem with that, but we have to think about the exact table we're at, exactly what we're trying to do, the entirety of the range, especially the more and more you're playing against better players, you have to think about what your range looks like, not just, hey, I'm playing ace-king here. It's like, no, you're playing a range of hands, and ace-king is one of the hands in that range. But, yeah, I mean, again, you could convince me of situations where the check raise is great, but there are just so many spots where it's not, and if you don't know, the smaller c-bet size here I think is going to be far better than checking and especially checking and then playing it the way that it exactly played out. So any more thoughts on the flop, or are we pretty much good here?
No, I just think it's something that like you always want to try and consider all your options. And I think that's an option that most live players don't consider. And oftentimes in a small stakes game, it is the best play, and it allows you to do with a lot of hands. Like you don't have to be as precise when you make that small bet. Whereas like if you make that large bet in a 6-way multi-way pot, like you have to be winning an overwhelming majority of the time. So even if it like checks around you and you have like queens or something like that, you know, you can't be betting large because it requires you winning a huge percentage of the time. And by reducing that bet size, you reduce your investment into the pot and you create lots of favorable scenarios.
Yep, 100% agree with that. Excellent. All right, so let's run out the rest of the flop. So again, cutoff bets 100, button calls, hero check raises, cutoff calls, button folds. Going on to the turn, 8 of spades. And I mean, at this point, it's a bloated pot. You've pretty much said, hey, I'm committing myself to this. It's not like we were planning on like check folding on a brick turn, and the 8 of spades is functionally brickish. So hero just decides to mash it in. Thoughts here? Would you do anything else?
Once we check raise, I mean, this was a brick turn. We fortunately have not had to deal with like what we do on a diamond or a scary Broadway. And yeah, I mean, I'm totally committed at this point.
Yeah, I think checking here would just be just the worst thing in the entire world. I can't see any reason to do that. So yeah, just jam it through. I mean, you're still giving them a decent price and just rock and rolling. Whatever it runs out is whatever it runs out. And in this situation, cutoff calls with a7 of diamonds, ends up hitting that diamond on the river and ends up shipping the whole thing. And, you know, hero's right to go back and study this hand and look at it and try to get some other opinions on it. I think all that's very good. I think the key takeaway here, though, is really thinking about the flop decision. That c-bet or not c-bet decision is key. Obviously, if you do take the check route, the size on the check raise is very important. I think 300, I think we both agree 300 is just simply the wrong number. Mm-hmm. But looking for that c-bet and thinking about the smaller size c-bet rather than, you know, some people, I guess if we go back to the flop, might try to fire this for like 75 or 80 and get closer to that 2/3, 3/4, but it's just simply not going to be the right play for the range as a whole. And again, that smaller size is just very pretty, very attractive. So I like all of this. Jack, thank you so much for sending this hand in. Chris, you have any more thoughts on this hand or anything tangential?
Yeah, I would just say, like, remember, we're always trying to make our opponents make mistakes. And, you know, our specific line, and when you look at it against the draw, did we really generate a mistake? Was it a mistake for a7 of diamonds to bet $100 on the flop? Nope. Was it a mistake for them to call the 200? Nope. And was it a mistake for them to call the turn? Game 3-1, I think it's close, but probably okay. If you consider just like, it's good to just have, you know, hands that you call with that your opponents can't bluff you. So, you know, he's preventing us from shoving draws profitably, etc. Even if he has a break even against our pairs. No. Versus if we had shoved the flop. Now we're not saying that's the line, but like if we had shoved the flop, now he's like, ooh, I wonder if he has the draw, or maybe he folds. But we're giving the opportunity for him to make mistakes. So I think it's just like a lesson to remember that, like, we're trying to create favorable scenarios and we're trying to generate mistakes. And our check raise line, I think, really got the worst part of both of those scenarios.
Yep. 100% agreed with that. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Chris, for joining. Again, Jack, thank you so much for sending this hand in. If you have any comments or questions, please don't hesitate to let us know. Leave a comment down below. And as always, make sure to like and subscribe as well. If you need anything, let us know. Otherwise, as always, good luck out there and happy grinding.